Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. Pardon the empty office. We will be relocating to a new studio soon. I just wanted to get more videos out for you people while we are doing that work. We're finishing up Phil Neel's second essay, A Quarter Pound of Flesh, that was published as a sequel to his first essay, A Quarter Pound of Flesh, Part 1. Which came out at the end of 2024. This one came out in February 2025. There are some parts of it that are already dated, but it is a good reflection on what we might call bergonomics, which is the way that hamburgers can stand in as a object-subject relation for most of the developed industrial post-neoliberal economy, or neoliberal in one country economy, or whatever the hell we want to call this right now. I think it's post-neoliberal seems to be optimistic. The public-private partnership and the shift towards rents, which many people today are calling neo-feudalism, is actually a trait of neoliberalism. It was part of the financialization of the 1970s. Are we post that? Well, we clearly aren't in the globalized form of neoliberalism that existed during the 90s. But honestly, that kind of ended in 2007 anyway. Although globalization was still an ongoing concern. Why do I say 2007? And that's when we started changing the way we handled banking pretty significantly. But let's go into this. Neel here, we are in the middle of the essay. You can find this on Brooklyn Rail. The link will be in the show notes. We're in a section called Negotiated Defeat, after he talked about the kind of big wins of the union of the stevedores and shipping container packers that he was talking about, and how limited those wins really were when you adjusted for inflation and dealt with purchasing parity, etc. And he uses the burger as a nominal figure for purchasing parity because it's caloric. You literally need them to survive, so you can actually calculate the amount of calories going into a person for the work they do in a day. So it's actually a very useful objective correlative there. So, and it also belies inflation and nominal spending. So we can actually see what the caloric value is going into a work day versus like whatever nominal money terms you get, because the money's value changes so much. This is one of the debates that makes like figuring out rates of profit so damn difficult, is that if you're using currency to do it, and then of course if you're using state official stats, they're going to be denotated in currency values shift around. And even if you're using like an index of general goods, well, are the goods actually the same? Has there been shrinkflation, which is super common? Has there been substitution of cheaper parts for the same price, et cetera, et cetera? That doesn't show up in nominal inflation rates, but they're very real. I mean, I have stuff made from the 70s versus stuff made now. And even from the 70s, which was the beginning of neoliberalism, you can see a change in the material components, some for the good, but a lot for the worse as far as longevity and usefulness goes. Planned obsolescence becomes more and more of a thing, although it's been a thing for most of the history of capitalism, so it's not totally new there either. This long foray, though, will get us into the essay, so let's jump right into Neel's essay. It's very good, and I'm going to remind you, he's a very literary political economy writer and a political geographer. He's a joy to read. Even if sometimes it's almost hyperbolic. So I will talk a lot about that coming up. All right. No, that's not really that legible now, is it? Here we go. Ultimately, in the approach of these focused on real gains, the union is understood to be nothing more than a mediator representing the interests of the workers and making sure the various government regulations are followed. And the government regulations are onerous. Just read Joe Barnes' book, Class Struggle Unionism, or Jim McAlevy's book or Kim Moody's books. They don't agree on how you leverage that, but they're pretty clear on the limitations of the law. Many reading this today might find such a description to be merely common sense. After all, what else could unions be? They have never in our lifetime served as agents of social change, at least not since they were neutered in the 30s by the very thing that most democratic socialists celebrate. Maybe the democratic socialists have grown up, but I remember from 2014 to, 2022, basically, the FDR obsessions of the past. But this inherited notion of what a union is, and even the idea that it is part of a larger labor movement composed of worker-friendly politicians and NGO operatings across a broader civil society, is itself a result of a long and brutal defeat in which the real working class institutions aiming for far loftier goals were systematically broken apart, violently purged of the communists who shaped them. See what happened to the AFL-CIO in 1951. That's me adding that, but that's the most obvious thing. And didn't just happen, but this isn't just in America. This has happened even in places that do not go through such an obvious legal limitation. And then decomposed. What we call unions today merely wear the flesh of a thing that they help kill. This, within the common sense framework deployed by today's labor movement, the basic functioning of the market and the divide between the workers and the owners, each in their own way subordinate to the fundamental dictates of profitability as enshrined in the very structure of the corporation, are never questioned. Unions are understood to be fighting for labor to receive its fair share of the total income and are therefore operating from the outset in an inferior delimited position as mere negotiators or regulators within a framework that they no longer have the power to change. And this is where communization and its relationship to historical council communism is actually very clear. Their distrust of any form of the labor movement. Now, I actually do share the critique of business unionism here that Neel does. So I would say this is true too, but that these shells of things are what we have. I mean, just like parties are what we have. We need to change them, but if you don't work with any organ of worker collectivity, I don't know how you do this stuff. All right. From this perspective, the consistent decline in the labor share of income is ultimately due to the incidental political choices rather than economic necessity, class conflict, or any long-run structural trends in the ongoing development of capitalist society. Yep, this is the problem with reformists, is they actually deny that capitalism has a degenerative logic. And even if you accept things like modern monetary theory, which I do accept as a de facto description of, and even a de facto description of the way money actually works in the imperial cores of society, and some places that are strong enough and have relative power compared to those imperial cores. I would say that even with that, you still see a lot of other degenerative trends that can't be explained just in terms of nominal money profitability. Like, why is it that like physical commodities are so hard to make high profit margins on, expressed in real and not nominal terms? And as explained by a typical account that adheres to this conservative logic, quote, while there has been a downturn trend in labor share of income since the 1980s for 42 out of 49 countries, that does not necessarily indicate the lower demand for labor overall. It simply can mean that workers have weak bargaining power. Yeah, but that doesn't explain why they don't have weak bargaining power, right? And I think Neel's going to get to that, so let's continue. In other words, the viewpoint offers only an extremely narrow political horizon in which the socialistic goal of ending the tyranny of the property is completely abandoned, yep, and replaced with a moderate intervention in the administration of the unchangeable property system itself, still tilting the scales such that workers are apportioned a few more burgers by the very lords from whom they expend their lives and labor. And this drives me up the wall. You're just asking the people who lord over you to give you a little bit more crumbs. Not even your own autonomy, not in any real sense. and usually only so long as they themselves produce these extra burgers. After all, conceiving the goal to be increased bargaining power already concedes the entire question of class conflict. Yep. Nor is this simply a theoretical position. No, it is not just theoretical. The basic framework of profit sharing was enshrined in the original productivist bargaining struck in the 1950 Treaty of Detroit, which is basically the basis of Fordism, by the way. And we see how Detroit's turned out. It's a little better these days, but a watershed in the history of labor relations in the United States, which accepted that collective bargaining would not seek to challenge the distribution of income by establishing the principle that the average wage gauge should be tied to the productivity growth. Bingo. This was always a compromise in both Keynesian social democracy as understood in Northern Europe, the Fordism of the United States, and whatever hybrid model Western Europe has been running. Ultimately, this approach treats the persistent poverty as some sort of aberration rather than an outcome of actively produced by the operation of our social system. Bingo as well. Sorry, liberals and social democrats and about half of democratic socialists. In this narrative, low wages and high subsistence costs are not necessary features of market discipline. Nope, they're not. Austerity kills as if it is a choice. No, well, it's not a choice if people want to maintain their class power now, is it? The things forcing workers to be workers in the first place, but instead the incidental result of corporate greed, I hate that word, metastasizing within the market. In some cases, they are even presented as a breakdown of efficient competition under the weight of monopoly. But the conservative undertones of this idea are easily demonstrated. In this view, there is nothing wrong with the domination wielded by the wealthy over the world. Whenever people talk about the billionaire class and not about the owners of capital, I know there's a problem because and this has become common with liberals with social democratic inclinations. That's how they think about things. Take, for example, the common talking point that arises in any contract negotiation, in which record corporate profits are contrasted with miserly miserly concessions by the company. This is, on the face, always true, and yet the same logic also cuts both ways, since companies used dips in profitability that occurred during the periodic economic crises and long stretches of slower growth as an excuse to eliminate pensions, refuse wages, reduce benefits, and systematically implement tier systems that result in de facto pay cuts for the average worker that unions often accept. This was a big deal in 2007 and why so many people turned against the UWA under its old UAW under its old leadership. Sorry, aphasia again. I hate acronyms. Unions, having no response, often just retrench around their core constituency, older full-time employees in legacy occupations, as well as their own staff tasked with managing the steady flow of dues in the portfolio of often substantial pension funds. This was actually a problem even in the public sector. And I could talk about why, even after the Red State revolts and the growth in faith in teachers' unions, it kind of petered out in the last 2 or 3 years in places that weren't like in the industrial Midwest, where there's much more social unionizing amongst teachers. Social unionizing means getting out of just the struggle for your immediate concerns. And the reason why, you can hear about what the Chicago teachers unions are with some of the stuff going on in the Midwest, and I want to give that its credit. There is a lot of non-interest in some of these associations that they don't even view themselves as unions, even when they have the right to collectively bargain. That they do not really have an interest in new teachers because they assume new teachers are only going to teach for 3 to 5 years, and they're statistically correct in doing so. But of course, they're undermining their own base, and increasingly they solidify their incomes through property management and buying buildings and leveraging the assets of the buildings as opposed to dues. Yeah, not a great look. Anyway, back to the essay. What's worse, the vast majority of unions, in fact, help to enable decades of working class defeats that they now decry, since their basic framework of collective bargaining on the basis of profit sharing compelled them to force through a series of poor contracts in the wake of frequent crises, particularly after the 70s, an increasing number of bad years as mandated by the dictates of the balance sheet. See the Treaty of Detroit. Something that people don't bring up that much anymore because it's kind of not been in a lot of people's favor. After the Great Recession in 2008, for example, the Teamsters, the UAW, and nearly every other major union in the country completely capitulated to the demands made by the companies. Yes, they did. Often working with employers to roll out new technologies and implement company-wide austerity measures that justified in terms of belt tightening. Not only did they do this, but this was why a lot of the class struggle, union struggles happened in the Teamsters and the UAW, and why you got Sean O'Brien and Sean Fain ultimately as the end results of that process, although with very different orientations. In the name of protecting their existing constituents, these unions even allowed and in many cases advocated for the imposition of tiered wage systems within the company. I've seen that a bunch. In the logistics sector, this was visible in the divide between usually full-time drivers and usually part-time warehouse workers, with each group then furtherly subdivided between older workers with full seniority and solid pensions retained from earlier deals in new temp, seasonal, and contract, or otherwise denigrated workers not fully covered by most contract gains, or even some that were outsourced at the expense of their own workers, but to make the balanced profitability work. This happened with the Teamsters, one of the Teamsters contracts a few years back with UPS. All right. It was a result of these concessions that the public approval of unions fell dramatically with the financial crisis, reaching an all-time low in 2009 when the Gallup poll found that only 48% of Americans approved of labor unions, down from 75% in the mid-50s, which I think is fascinating. This has been reversed, but every financial crisis, the labor unions become less popular, not more. And actually, we saw a little bit of this in the teaching sector during COVID, where the unions actually lost, and particularly in some red states, a lot of newly earned credibility. Depends on where you are, though. I don't want to overgeneralize about that. The new unionism. The gradual revival and reinvention of unionism in the US has so far only slowly begun to climb out of the hole dug by decades of collaborationist concessions. And although recently expressed in major leadership changes within the UAW and the Teamsters, we see how that has turned out in both cases, actually. Although, Sean Fain's not a villain. Sean O'Brien probably is less of a villain than a lot of leftists want him to be, but both of them are particularly concessionist and are also not particularly consistent. This revival was, in fact, initiated outside the auspices of the former labor relations system entirely. The rising popularity of working class organizations, visible not only in growing popularity of unions, but also an interest in tenants organizing, which has a lot less effective levers to do anything, mass participation in anti-police riots, and opinion polls clearly show mass support for them. I mean, we see this even with the public turning against Cuomo running and Mandani winning in New York. And more power to him, because I hate Cuomo. But I will tell you, if the histories of some of the other Democratic socialist mayors without real legislatures or city councils to back them up is an example, this probably won't go well. I mean, we can look at what happened in Chicago. It's just still happening. Right now, the mayor of Chicago is actually even less popular than the super unpopular predecessor of an Obama clone, Lori Lightfoot, that he replaced. All right. Etc. was in fact triggered both by tireless wildcat labor organizing within and against the union bureaucracy. Yep, already visible in the wave of the teacher strikes in 2018. The teacher strikes, and I said this at the time, were often dragging the AFT and the NEA and their local and state counterparts with them. And this was also true for the Chicago teachers unions, who basically had to set up their own camp, and in many cases about the unions in the purple Midwest, like Minnesota and Wisconsin, particularly in Wisconsin, where the real anger over the loss of collective bargaining was not actually properly leveraged after Democrats used it for a voting plank. Anyway, back to this. Similarly, while the politically naive progressives believe that it was the Bernie Sanders campaign that pushed Biden to the left, I mean, I even heard this from DSA people and people who should know better, like Eric Blanc. It is hardly coincidence that the labor-friendly policies pursued by the administration over the last 4 years were only adopted after a town core of nearly every American city was looted hollow and set aflame in a long, hot summer of discontent. This is, in fact, exactly the pattern followed throughout the history of the U.S. labor relations. The violent strikes of the Gilded Age gave way to reforms of the Progressive Era. Massive bloody labor wars in the 1920s and early 1930s were followed by the implementation of the current labor relations systems. Mass rioting and renewed labor mobilizations throughout the post-war U.S., particularly in the South, resulted in the passage of the Great Society, anti-poverty, and civil rights legislation. This is all true. Although I would say, the love of riots is a communization thing. But I also want to point out that we have already tried to forget, because of how quickly they were recuperated, both in terms of labor and in terms of racial politics, these movements. Black Lives Matter is largely, it's not discredited so much as people just don't want to talk about its aftermath and why DEI was not particularly effective. Why the talking points of Black Lives Matter and the college activism that it was filtered through in the late teens after the first round in 2014, as I like to say, the movement from the industrial core and Black neighborhoods into solidarity, strikes, riots, and protests in Seattle and the coastal cities. But we also saw this with the move of Black Lives Matter in the teens, not the 2020, not the post-Floyd uprising stuff, from Maryland and St. Louis and Baltimore into college campuses during that time period, and it changed their talking points considerably. And that happened again with the shift from what happened in the Floyd uprisings into what became the DEI initiatives of the 2021 and the early Biden administration, which became unpopular pretty much instantly. All right. The basic lesson, and one that cannot simply be parsed within the framework of unionism as a good faith negotiation, is the greater disruption of business as usual, more expansive threats to property, and more organized forms of self-defense against Pinkertons and police were the only path to securing greater gains, even if they also pose the risk of repression. In other words, building a genuine working class organization required first acknowledging that class conflict exists, and after this, acknowledging that this conflict is inherently violent. And most social democratic answers to this have been basically class collaborationists, which are just asking your overlords to play nice with you and that you're going to regulate them more if they don't. And not being really able to deal with the violent repression that's tied to counter ways to deal with that. To fight this class war, you must, in fact, fight. And time and again, the gains won through class conflict have themselves served to secure the defeat of the conflictual organizations that made them possible in the first place. Recuperation is in this DNA. That's me adding that. The very necessity of addressing the basic question of subsistence within struggle, winning very real material gains that have immediate impact, soon became a cage restraining and eventually starving the struggle itself. Jasper Burns explains the basic conundrum in a game theoretical terms. Jasper Burns likes analytical Marxism in interesting and weird ways. One of the things I like about Burns. In this model, class conflict is reduced to a pair of simultaneous equations of labor and capital, where labor chooses the wage rate by its degree of militancy, and capital determines the rate of investment by virtue of its property right. I mean, while workers in this scenario naturally inclined to increase militancy as much as possible and therefore increase their consumption, doing so will provoke disinvestment and thus enter counterproductivity, lower future wages. And here Burns is actually picking up on the work, I believe, of John Romer. In the 70s and 80s of that period of analytic Marxism, which is very different than the current period of analytic Marxism represented by people like Matt McManus, Ben Burgess, Vivek Chibber, etc. And the ultimate result is an euphoria in which socialism can never be reached through a gradual process of socialization mediated by trade unions and workers' parties, the Bernstein approach, because under these constraints, which are precisely found in the logic of profit sharing described above, Workers will never choose to move in a direction of total expropriation and seizure of the whole sum of the social product, because any step in that direction will produce capital flight and will immediately lower workers' future consumption. And I actually think Burns is right about that tendency. Precisely in order to be real, any gains must always be restrained. These are the same contradictions visible in the glistening meat of the hamburger. Finally, we return to the bergonomics and the caloric understanding of political economy. Despite the misery of work, the problem is not one of immiseration per se. Overall, the social system produces enough burgers for enough workers to scrape by on roughly feudal levels. Every time gains are won, inflation resets the scales and strikes start again. We see that in the 2020s already. We saw a lot of wage gains, but inflation has definitely outstripped them, and we're probably back to a much lower point than when we started. The entire process is, of course, marked by deep geographic inequity. Thank you, world systems theory, for making that a little bit clearer, and certain political contingency. But the basic pattern holds surprising consistency throughout the history of capitalism, and I would add, even in the core. The 50s is basically the only time where labor aristocracy really expanded to a whole lot of people. Even in aggressive subsistence struggles pursued to their natural end always lead back to the same losing game. In other words, the true horror of the burger is not that capitalism ensures mass starvation, although it does do this selectively, that the workers' demands are never met, even though they are not, or that you can't make a living on 2 or 3 burgers an hour, though sometimes you cannot. On the contrary, capitalism is also quite obviously a developmental force capable of producing hamburgers in historically unprecedented quantities and distributing them at least a sufficient amount to the global population on average. The real horror is not that the system produces absolute immiseration, asterisk, it doesn't all the time, and even now it doesn't all the time, even though it's getting worse, but precisely the opposite. It produces an immense material abundance, the scale of which is entirely unprecedented in the history of humankind, and that, despite this, it reproduces the worst medieval horrors at larger and larger scales. Inequity is far greater now than it's ever been in human history. That's just a fact. It produces just enough for most workers while producing far too much for a small sliver of people at the top of the social hierarchy and far too little for the poorest third of the species. In other words, it is tantalizing torture. Within a capitalist society, abundance can only be secured by simultaneously imposing an artificial scarcity. Rather than the workers having access to the total surplus of burgers that they all collectively produce, that surplus is held in the hands of burger billionaires who own the vast bulk of the meat coursing across the planet. And this is my big debate with conservatives like Kevin Williamson, who thinks that scarcity is the predominant thing in our economy. Well, if the scarcity is fucking fake, then no, it isn't. As of 2023, the richest 1% of the human population, located predominantly in the US, Europe, and East Asia. Yes, East Asia is where a lot of it is. China, Korea, the Republic of Korea, and Japan, own as much wealth as the bottom 95% combined. The world itself is therefore already divided between zones of caloric surplus and caloric deficit. But at this deeper level, this division is also literally what makes you into a worker into the first place, subjecting you every day to the dictatorship of your immediate boss, and set with the grander dictatorship of the company, which itself is subject to the ultimate suzerain, the global market. And if you're subject to the global market, your country might be able to mitigate it, but you're still subject to capital. Sorry, people who think magical things happen when there's countries that don't follow every dictate of the American neoliberal version of capitalism is somehow outside of the capitalist market. They're not. This series of dictatorships commands the bulk of your waking hours and therefore the bulk of your life. Unless you already occupy the upper echelon, sitting in a boardroom rather than tolling on the lower floors, you have absolutely no economic suffrage. You get no vote in and have no influence over the institutions which you spend most of your life. At most, you can quit and move to another job that is exactly the same as every other major respect. This is a rule of the hamburger. And to topple the tyranny requires more than simply winning more burgers. Even if burgers for less work may be necessarily an initial step, proceeding from the subsistence to subsistence eventually leads down and through the abyss. Sooner or later, Ascending further than subsistence requires a leap from economic organization to organized partisan conflict, or in other words, from mere survival and self defense to a holy war against a hamburger and all that it represents. The meat inside the skin. In abstract terms, we can say that the partisan project is always focused on the question of property, or more specifically, the wedging of property relations into a metabolic gap separating the species from its subsistence. The hamburger is not simply a mundane symbol of food. It is instead a symbol of the system that has processed food into a property that can be, and in fact must be, withheld from us until we submit to the social domination of its owners. And you and I are not owners. I mean, not really. I do have stock because I have a 401k and some investments, but I don't even own a full share of any company that I know of. I own like fractional shares, and that puts me above a lot of people too. And investing us in the fractional shares was a way to reduce class conflict. That was its aim, by the way. And you can't voluntarily get out of that either, because you won't have a pension and you'll starve. Right. The sum of our personal possessions is statistically nothing at all when compared to the grand mass meat commanded by the companies pulsing through the grid. What is needed then is not so much a new unionism as a return to an older principle of working class organization, in which any individual union or other form of sustained mobilization around the issue of subsistence operates within a partisan ecosystem composed of formal and informal aspects. Wow, I can't believe I agree with Neel on this. I was not expecting Neel to go here. That we actually needed partisan conflict with formal organizations and informal organizations, all committed to the broader political project of annihilating the very conditions that force the workers to be workers in the first place. Exactly what this might look like today depends entirely on the local situation. I guess there goes invariance there. I'm just noticing some conflicts within communization. For those of you who don't get the reference to Bordiga and Bordiga's influence on communization, I'm not going to go into it right now, but it is actually important to know. Exactly what this look like today depends entirely on the local situation, and that the larger ecosystem is only in a very early stage of development, if at all. Nonetheless, although day-to-day battles over the burger are the starting point of such a conflict, it is absolutely essential that these substantial struggles be, from the onset, used to construct forms of organizing aimed at more than mere subsistence. Anything else is already a failure. 100% agreed. In fact, I would say constantly narrowing your horizons eventually is betrayal. I've said this for 15 years. The holy war against the hamburger, therefore, has two aspects equally necessary. While it begins with the literal war fought to secure and defend specific gains and must retain its pragmatic dimension, especially as repression intensifies, taking on a more military character, it can only proceed as a social war against the very world that birthed it. And this world is founded on the quarter pound of flesh, bodies toiling under the grid, hungry and tired, just able to afford a spare few hamburgers before the minor blessing of fitful sleep in the early hours of the morning, woken here and there by the maddening screams of people forced to live outside, and then by the great grind of the construction equipment churning across the asphalt as other workers, fueled by other burgers, build some new luxury apartment complex across the street, clean, cold, and empty. Look into the burger. Glimpse the many cows melted into a single eldritch abomination. See the jungle burned in the same maddening ritual. The seething tollbone of green raised to charred black soil, followed by neat rows of soy that stretched like city blocks as far as the eye can see. All destined for a feedlot, asterisk. And the amount of water sacrificed to this is amazing. I lived in a place called La Laguna in Torreon, Coahuila in Mexico. Mexico, if I want to like overpronounce it like a white person. And I did that for 2 years. The greatest depletion of the water, even for human beings there, which was already filled with arsenic from low tables. And that's not because Mexico is unclean or any racist stereotype you may have. It was because they wanted the water down to keep the cows going. And it had shrunken La Laguna into hard to tell that it was ever a lagoon in the first place. We already see that happening here. What happens in the quote periphery will happen in the periphery of the core eventually. Just like what happens to the most oppressed Black and brown workers happens to white workers too, usually eventually. Although at least the white workers supposedly get the benefit of feeling superior to someone who got theirs first, I suppose. Nonetheless. See the meat packer clocking out from her 12-hour shift and robed in blood, the farm worker with lungs scarred by a lifetime of fungal infections, the delivery driver who is legally not an employee but an independent contractor making less than minimum wage on a bad night. Yeah, people here who work for these delivery drivers can make between $7 and $30 an hour, but it's like not based on anything consistent. Driving a personal vehicle that has its window smashed out every week by people even more broken and desperate. That doesn't happen as much out here. That happens. Interestingly, the property violence isn't even totally predictable on poverty, but poverty's exposure to wealth. I mean, this is a point even David Brooks makes, and he's not wrong about it. Anyway, imagine the things that you yourself have done to obtain a burger, and imagine the things you'll be able to do to make wars kindle in the distance and the oceans rise, and anyone fleeing the horrors let to drown, and the wine dark sea are deported in mass back to the ruin that they fled, where they will be forced to suffer the appetites of corporations that rove across the warming world like monsters through rubble, and particularly in those periphery quotation areas where a lot of that's even informal and they have no protections at all. Anyway, back to this. The burger reveals that there are two types of people, and in the end, the first, those who believe that the technologically complex society is impossible without these horrors, which is most people actually, even though they don't admit it, or at the very least, without the continual threat of starvation imposed by artificial scarcity of basic necessities. See again the Kevin Williamson crew. In other words, they earnestly believe that people will not work at all unless compelled to under threat of death, which is ridiculous. We did so for hundreds of thousands of years as hunter gatherers, and that this alone justifies social domination as a necessary stimulus for the creation of any social surplus whatsoever. This is pretty common. I mean, David Graeber's hyper voluntaristic answer to this is more or less bullshit, but he's right that this is what the other side believes and why we should stand up against it. Second are those who know that the entire history of humanity demonstrates the exact opposite to be true. That domination is not necessary, but instead is a vast and violent social ritual imposed on people by the people, and that it can therefore be overthrown by people. We've done it multiple times. The history of the burger is, in the end, just a natural and necessary as the divine right of kings. In other words, a technologically complex society capable of producing material abundance, in fact, luxury for all it's perfectly possible, and can be administered deliberately by all the members of this society without threatening the majority of the world's population with starvation and without subjecting millions across the planet to the medieval horrors in order to secure the comfort of a chosen few. I would actually say sub-medieval horrors, to be quite frank. I don't think we should demonize the medieval world that much. Moreover, all this can be done with less energy than we use now. Yep, this is a part of degrowth I'm actually up on. When people hear me critique degrowth, they think I'm critiquing, shrinking things, and I'm like, you might need initial energy outlays that are quite high in the beginning, but to to develop more evenly, you particularly need it. But in the long run, no, you don't, and you could do it with a much smaller material footprint, just like Neel says, with a much smaller material footprint and on less land to be put to better use for rehabilitating metabolism of the human species with its environment. And rehabilitating the environment, we really fucked. Not for its own sake, but for ours. I'm not saying this out of the kindness of my heart for animals. I love animals. I care about animals, but that's not why I'm saying this. But creating such a future requires first recognizing the point of social struggle is not to work for the burger, to eat the burger, to strike to the increase the labor share of income and guarantee more burgers for more workers, or even to seize all the burgers and place them under the control of the worker. This is where communization is different from classical Marxism, by the way. Just want to point that out. And Neel is a communizer, to the best of my knowledge at this point. The point is to unmake the very way the burger itself is made. And this future can only be secured through protracted war. There is a weird malice tinge to Neel's writing that I'm amused by. Waged against the hamburger as it currently exists, and against its defenders and against its false critics. Now that's a little bit harsher than I am. The false critics can be made to be real critics. I don't necessarily need to wage war on them yet. But this is why I guess I'm only kind of an ultra leftist, whatever the hell that means. So, where does it leave us? Let's get back here. Now, to return to the restaurant along the freeway, imagine the scene perfectly American, the smell of grease, the dark shine of chrome, the glass windows mirrored to the obscure outer dark. But somewhere in that darkness, you know that there is a freeway. You can sense it, like any American can. The asphalt stretched from the Permian forest out to the infinite abyss beyond, and the machines shooting across like comets. Imagine it. Now, scrawled across the burger wrappers, the jottings of some madmen. I slump back, my limp slack with the sudden exhaustion, as if the spirit had, at least, been pulled from me to join those other ghosts wandering there on the plains behind the glass mirror by the white burn of fluorescence. These numbers cannot be real, you say to yourself. Hamburgers don't cost as much. If 40 hours a week isn't enough, these lazy workers should try 60. You stare out the window into the same darkness, seeing only your own face reflected, and behind you, the hamburger feeling out the kitchen in their slow procession. How did you get here? You ponder the question, and you cannot remember. You were at work, you think, or maybe you were about to go to work. The ink on the wrappers bleeds into the grease, and when your hands brush up against the waxy paper, it is startlingly loud, like the leaves crunching behind you in the forest at night. Inside your stomach, you feel the burgers writhing as the ground beef extruded from the meat grinder were so many quarter pounds of hungry pink worms. They inhibit you as you inhibit the world, recklessly hungry. The infinite self that has eaten environment and lives alone, unencroached on, and perfectly gorged one God. You feel them pressing up from underneath the skin, insatiably seeking your every extremity. They compel your muscles, like strings pulling the limbs of the puppet. Perhaps you have always been here. The worms weave themselves into a diaphanous web of nerves inside the meat. Your touch is their touch. Your spine is an obelisk around which they twist in mystical ecstasy. Your pain a thing they can drink. Gaze into your body and find the motions of your work encoded by the worms. Muscle memory of lifting, typing, the feel of machines beneath your fingers. I look at you like a ghost peering back through that window. There is no traffic on the interstate, but there are shapes moving out there in the darkness beyond the highway. Can you hear the feet pounding there through rows of grain that were once an ocean of root and grass, which the great beast lumbered forth to extinction? When the worms in your body reach your eyes, you know that they will unveil to you the truth of the hamburger, vulgar and raw and terrible. You do not want to see it. The grill sputters like a dying animal, and you look at your phone. Your shift soon starts. It's time to go to work. Harsh, harsh realities. Harsh, harsh realities indeed. What do you make of that is going to depend on you. Now, I think pre-majority unionism, class struggle unionism, and even going beyond a lot of what we think of as traditional socialism may be necessary. But we aren't there. We're not even kind of there. And a lot of the last 15 years, the people pretending that they can get there, and then dumbasses reacting to that into obscurantism and paranoia because they don't want to look at this either. The number of people who just call me stupid for pointing these kinds of things out is actually kind of astounding. I'm not here to gloat with them. I used to be one of them. And hopefully I'm speaking to some of them. Hopefully Neel's speaking to some of them. Because you need to demand more than you are. And most of you have been steadily demanding less. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and protect your peace. Take care.